Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. Welcome. We'll go ahead and start the panel. My name is Deborah James, and I coordinate the Our World Is Not for Sale network, which is a global network of over 250 civil society organizations from over 50 countries, united to advocate for a just, sustainable, and democratic multilateral trading system. We have a very distinguished panel here today focused on the crisis in multilateralism and what are solutions for inclusive and sustainable growth. I'll introduce the panel, and then I will make some introductory remarks, and then you will have the great opportunity to hear from all of them. We had confirmed the presence of Ambassador from South Africa, Xavier Karim, and due to unforeseen circumstances, he unfortunately urgently had to travel home and is not here this week. But we are very glad to welcome Vahini Naidu, who is the Foreign Economic Representative accredited to the South African Permanent Mission here of the WTO in Geneva, and they are the coordinator of the Africa Group, and so speak in a united voice. We will also hear from Prerna Bomzan to my right, who is from the Third World Network, which is one of the premier intellectual centers of economic thought from developing countries, from the TWN in Nepal. We will also then hear from Richard Kozel-Wright, who many of you know is the director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which is the publisher of the annual Trade and Development Report, which I think is the most important document of the year to read every year to understand what's happening with trade and development. And last but absolutely not least, we will hear from Ravi Kant, who is an extremely well-known journalist based here in Geneva covering trade and globalization issues for many, many decades with the South-North Development Monitor. So speaking from Our World Is Not for Sale, our organizations represent millions of the workers and farmers, the environmental advocates, development and public interest advocates who believe that trade can help promote development and shared prosperity around the world. But we also know that it depends on the policy environment in which this trade occurs. And so we have to say that we feel that we are more honest than many people who work in this building in acknowledging that the current set of rules of globalization that has been implemented by the WTO over the last 23 years has utterly failed to promote that shared prosperity. Now, there has been poverty reduction in the world. We all know that. Many world leaders and advocates of the model of globalization embodied in the WTO will give credit to the WTO or to globalization. And by this they mean, as we know, liberalization of tariffs, such as in the GATT, the liberalization including privatization, deregulation, and foreign market presence in services under the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the liberalization of agriculture, in which the US and EU are still allowed to subsidize agricultural products that are exported, while developing countries are restricted from doing so, even if it's necessary to feed their poor populations. And this is the Agreement on Agriculture, which is, as we know, responsible now for impoverishing millions of farmers and resulting in the fact, you might not know and is never talked about in these corridors, that there are now 815 million people who go hungry every night to bed. That's 11% of the population, and it's actually increasing. We also have a system that involves extreme patent monopolies, government protectionism, in which the government intervenes in the economy to stifle competition, promote monopolies, and drive prices upwards, which is the opposite of free trade, and has resulted in the net transfer of wealth of hundreds of billions of dollars from the South to the North and from consumers to a very tiny number of people of very special interests, which is a very protected class called patent holders. And now we see attempts to have the full liberalization of the future digital economy with the attempt to push aside the development agenda and the urgent need for agricultural reform and instead launch new negotiations on digital commerce. But it seems like people who advance this agenda, that globalization, are not living in the same world as the rest of us. Because what is that reality that we're living in? As I said before, we all know there has been a vast reduction in poverty in the last 25 years. However, you might not know that 2/3 of the net reduction in extreme poverty in the world since 1990 has occurred in China. And much of the remaining third was helped by the vast increase in China's imports from other developing countries, as well as hundreds of billions of dollars of their foreign investments, loan, and aid. So by this standard, Chinese globalization has done very well. But the same is not so clear for the other kind of globalization that has been advanced by the Washington-led institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and of course, the WTO here in Geneva. Now, I also work at an institution called the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And this that I'm talking about is documented in a report we published last year called the Scorecard on Development, in which every 5 years we look at the state of the world, looking at indicators such as health, education, longevity, infant mortality, income, inequality. And the results, actually, of the Scorecard on Development 1960 to 2016, China and the global economic rebound, are in direct contravention to the very ideological rhetoric of those who credit globalization for the benefits that China's development has brought to the rest of the world. Now, why is that? China has notably one of the few developing countries that decidedly did not follow the neoliberal path since 1980, and it multiplied its per capita income by a factor of 21 since by 2017, becoming one of the largest economies in the world. Because I would ask, which country in the last 10 years has built itself out of poverty by exporting to Europe or the United States, or by implementing TRIPS regulations, or by following the Agreement on Agriculture? There is a sharp contrast between Chinese development policy, which included state control over most investment, the financial system, the central bank, and much of its manufacturing, as well as a gradual transition from a planned economy to a mixed economy, versus the neoliberal reforms in most of the world during the 80s and 90s and consolidated and made the legal regime in the WTO since 1995. Now, this should be an important topic of debate. We should debate what are the sources of poverty reduction in the world, that which is happening and that which is not happening. And now we're seeing the negative impacts of globalization in high-income countries, such as mine from the United States, and this has recent years contributed to political upheaval. But that globalization has been defended as if it were a great boost to billions of people throughout the world. So if we understand that this type of globalization has not benefited the majority of people in developing countries, and we understand that now there's a huge populist revolt because that same globalization model has not benefited the vast majority of people even in the developed countries, but at the same time there's been a huge increase in wealth creation and a huge increase in trade and investment flows, where is all the money going? Well, it turns out that we have the answer in this year's Trade and Development Report. It's going to the top 1% of superstar vampire corporations who are sucking even more wealth out of the vast majority of people around the world in the global north and the global south and everywhere in between. And we would say that this corporate takeover is the predictable result of these firms using their wealth to intervene in the economy, to rewrite the rules through the WTO and also through bilateral and regional trade agreements and through electing austerity-focused national governments. So now we have a crisis in multilateral debates where countries are blaming India and China on one hand, the U.S. is attacking the WTO for the wrong reasons, and many people in this House are shocked that there has been a popular backlash against the entire economic model, which has actually failed them miserably. So again, trade can be good for development, but this particular model of trade rules embodied in the WTO has failed and has impoverished workers and farmers in the developed, developing world and in least developed countries, while exacerbating inequality greatly. And we should note in all of these conversations that over this entire trajectory, this period, Africa is not converging with the incomes of the middle or high income countries. So we are leaving an entire continent behind and sort of going on as if it's okay when 54 countries have maintained in unacceptable levels of decrease in inequality between the rich and the poor countries. So we call for a solution, a transformation of the existing system to prioritize food security, jobs, sustainable development, access to medicines, financial stability, quality, accessible public services, technology transfer, the prioritization of climate over trade, and now policies of digital industrialization to foment development instead of digital colonization. That would benefit all of the populations of the world, and governments should be excited to take on these transformations if they want to deliver development and shared prosperity to their people. So with that introductory background, I thank you all again for participating in this session, and I'd like to invite Bahini Naidu to take the floor. Again, she is the Foreign Economic Representative accredited to the South African Permanent Mission of the WTO in Geneva, whose embassy coordinates the Africa Group. Bahini.
Thank you, Deborah, and good morning, colleagues. I delivered this brief input on behalf of Ambassador Karim, who is unable to be here today. We all recognize that the WTO is facing its most serious challenges. We have all seen the series of trade measures over 2018 that have undercut basic rules and principles of the WTO, and we confront a growing and unprecedented threat to the dispute settlement mechanism with the impasse in the appellate body selection process. How do we respond? For some, the solution requires that the WTO rulebook be updated to fill in gaps to address what is now ironically characterized as an uneven playing field. The proposals now circulating mainly cover 6 issues aimed at narrowing the scope and application of special and differential treatment, adjusting the principle of consensus decision-making, regularizing plurilateral agreements, tightening rules on industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, and IP rights, strengthening rules on transparency and notification, and enhancing the role of the Secretariat in negotiations. Without going into the merits or demerits, it suffices to say that it is already clear that members will be unable to reach an agreement on these proposals. Discussions in the WTO on plurilaterals, consensus decision-making, and special and differential treatment proved divisive in the run-up to MC11, and the fact that there was no subsequent convergence at the ministerial conference itself underscores that the divergences now have a clear political underpinning. It is also clear that if these proposals continue to be pressed, they will elicit counter-demands that will gridlock any attempt to forge a balanced negotiating agenda. More than likely, the proposals will degenerate into more divergence, conflict, and deadlock, and the WTO will ratchet up another failure at a time when the organization is already teetering. We need an alternative, more circumspect approach that in the first instance focuses on the one issue that has some traction and a possibility for agreement. That is, we need to intensify and focus on fishery subsidies, and in parallel, we should mobilize our efforts around trying to overcome the appellate body impasse. Although the prospects look dim at present, without a solution here, existing WTO principles and rules, as well as all talk of new rules, will soon be redundant. On the question of appellate body reform, while procedural aspects appear more amenable to resolution, the more substantive concerns touch on fundamental differences in conception on dispute settlement, and it is far from clear that the gap between members' views can be bridged. If, however, the idea is to roll back what has been termed overreach by the appellate body, seeking to strengthen existing disciplines or to negotiate new rules would be, to say the least, disingenuous. Beyond this immediate focus on fishery subsidies and the appellate body, we should pay more attention to a thorough and more comprehensive diagnosis of the full range of challenges facing the multilateral trading system. We need an in-depth assessment of the underlying causes of the growing backlash against globalization, trade, and trade agreements from citizens and governments across the world. We all know that the benefits and costs of trade liberalization have not been shared equitably. Citizens are increasingly aware that the safety nets needed for trade adjustment are inadequate, and that job losses in declining sectors are rarely compensated by growth in others. Job insecurity is on the rise. We need to fully acknowledge the role of trade in the state of affairs and not shy away from assessing the extent to which trade and trade agreements have contributed to growing inequality across the world. A related area of interest is how trade agreements encourage or facilitate growing economic concentration, monopolistic and oligopolistic market structures across the global economy. In a word, we need to do much more to properly assess and respond to the challenges of inclusivity. We also need much more improved and balanced analysis of the conditions under which trade can generate more equitable outcomes within and between countries. We should also be ready to accept that it is reasonable to refrain from new rulemaking or further trade liberalization if the right conditions are absent. We need more realistic assessments of the impact of trade on growth, and we should cease from overselling the impact of trade for economic growth. We also need to consider how to address overreach in rulemaking and begin to appreciate the importance and value of difference amongst WTO members and citizens in respect to policy perspectives, policy imperatives, as well as the varied institutional arrangements for economic governance at the national level. Danny Roderick makes the point. There is no good reason for national economic models to converge, and world trade rules need to change to accommodate economic diversity. We all know that many developing countries remain deeply concerned by the imbalances in existing WTO rules that prejudice their trade and development interests. Africa remains the most marginal region in international trade and continues to exhibit excessive dependence on commodity exports and higher value-added imports. A measure of equity in the multilateral trading system will be the extent to which it facilitates Africa's structural transformation and industrialization for sustainable and sustained development. For legitimacy and sustainability, these concerns need to be addressed. In this respect, we can recall the full range of the so-called implementation issues advanced by developing countries that was integral to the negotiating agenda in the Doha Development Round. They include the critical issues of strengthening special and differential treatment provisions, addressing imbalances in the rules on agricultural domestic support, and enhancing food security, amongst others. For Africa, space to pursue industrial policy is paramount, and much more attention needs to be paid to redesigning trade agreements so they no longer constrain industrial development policy. This approach and these ideas are aimed at placing the multilateral trading system and the WTO on a more sustainable, inclusive, and developmental footing. In our view, such an assessment is a necessary prerequisite for a more cooperative, inclusive multilateralism that takes all members' interests and concerns fully into account. Clearly, solutions to the challenges facing the multilateral trading system will not be delivered quickly. But to strengthen the system in a sustainable and legitimate manner, this is not the time for precipitous, one-sided attempts at rulemaking in the WTO. In any case, all proposals for action in the WTO will be assessed against the standards of inclusivity and development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vahini, speaking of the interests of South Africa and of the Africa Group. Next, we are very happy to hear from Prerna Bomzan from the Third World Network based in Nepal.
Thanks, Deborah. I would like to start by giving a brief introduction regarding the UN-defined least developed countries, because I think people still mistake the LDCs as just low-income countries, but actually, because they are more vulnerable and disadvantaged members of the UN family, And it's not only because of the income criteria, but also because of the human assets, and there's also the economic vulnerability of LDCs. So LDCs actually, their low level of socioeconomic development, it's characterized by, as I said, weak human and institutional capacities, low and unequally distributed income, and scarcity of domestic financial resources. They often suffer from governance crisis, political instability, and in some cases, internal and external conflicts. Their largely agrarian economies are affected by a vicious cycle of low productivity and low investment. They rely on the export of few primary commodities as major source of export and fiscal earnings, which makes them highly vulnerable to external terms of trade shocks. Only a handful has been able to diversify into the manufacturing sector, though with a limited range of products in labor-intensive industries, that is, textiles and clothing. These constraints are responsible for insufficient domestic resource mobilization, low economic management capacity, weaknesses in program design and implementation, chronic external deficits, high debt burdens, and heavy dependence on external financing that have kept LDCs in a poverty trap. And we know that almost 75%, or LDCs depend almost 75% on external financing. And it's very clear that also ODA is used as a tide aid. We know very clear that tide aid is still a problem for LDCs. So according to the UN, as I said, they have the three criteria besides income. There is human assets index as well as economic vulnerability index. And I'd like to focus on the economic vulnerability, which is based on indicators of population size, remoteness of these LDCs. Then there's merchandise export concentration, the share of agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, the share of population in low elevated coastal zones. This is a new indicator which was introduced in 2015 triennial review. So that shows that LDCs are very vulnerable to environmental damages and constraints. And the other indicator is instability of exports of goods and services, obviously victims of natural disasters, and instability of agricultural production. So this category, it was established in 1971 by the UN General Assembly, obviously to draw special attention to these countries for more development attention. And that time there were only 23 LDCs, but today there are 47 LDCs. So that clearly shows that there is a major problem in the development paradigm that we are chasing. And out of the 47, 36 are WTO members. 8 of them, they are in progress of acceding to the WTO. And out of the 47, majority of them, 33, they are in Africa. 13 is in Asia and Pacific, and 1 is in Latin America, that is Haiti. And also among these 47 LDCs, 17 of them, there are landlocked developing countries, LLDCs, and 9 of them are small island development states. So this also shows the environmental and geographical constraints of these countries. So as I said before, the LDCs, it has more than doubled today, and that clearly is, that's clearly a sign of the failing development paradigm. And so I was checking the report of the subcommittee on LDCs of last year, October 2017, and there it says that the LDCs share of world merchandise exports, it remains under 1%, and its share in world exports of goods and commercial services, it stood at 0.91% in 2016, and the LDCs, they continue to record a sizable trade deficit, which reached $92.9 billion in 2016, which represents a 9-fold increase compared to the trade deficit in 2005, that is a decade back. And regarding their share in the ICT services, the committee report says that infrastructural constraints, low rates of access to the internet, poor connectivity, as well as lack of technological knowledge hinders the integration of LDCs, especially African LDCs, in world trade and ICT services. So this persistence of such a digital divide, it prevents LDCs from entering fully into new ways of trading goods and services, such as e-commerce, and to participate in global value chains. So this is a report of the subcommittee on the LDCs. So right now in the Doha round, the LDC package which we talk about, that is duty-free, quota-free market access, the rules, simpler rules of origin, and the services waiver, that we think as the development aspect of the Doha round. And as CSOs, we've been consistently calling for the early harvest of the LDC package. But right now, there hasn't been any movement in the negotiations. So clearly, for LDCs to benefit from trade for development, this early harvest of LDC package is very key. And the other is the means of implementation, actually. The means of implementation of the ODA. So we've been calling for 0.15 to 0.20% of ODA that should go to LDCs, and this has also been reaffirmed in the Istanbul Program of Action for the LDCs, which is for the decade 2011 to 2020. So this is very important. And the other means of implementation is technology transfer. So we know that there's this Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement, which says that, which obliges developed country members actually, that they shall provide incentives to enterprises and institutions in their territories for the purpose of promoting and encouraging technology transfer to LDCs in order to enable them to create a sound and viable technological base. And but we know for certain that there hasn't been any movement in this Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement. So we are calling for that. And then the other multilateral space for LDCs for development is the SDGs also. So many of the goals, they stress on special attention, development attention to the LDCs. And the other thing is regarding, since I'm following the climate change negotiations also, especially from the LDC perspective, out there in the UNFCCC also we see a crisis in multilateralism, basically because, one of the biggest historical polluters, the US, they have decided to pull out from the agreement. But it's quite it's quite unacceptable that they're still on the negotiating table, still negotiating the Paris Agreement work program, which is to be adopted later in December at the COP24 in Poland. And we know that the Paris Agreement, it's a very delicately balanced agreement where developing countries, they ensured that the principle of equity and the common but differentiated response, the CBTR principle, which is very important for us, which clearly shows differentiation between the developed and the developing countries. And so it's a very delicately balanced agreement, but now we are seeing in the negotiations that, especially we are going towards COP24, that the developed countries are still attempting to erode the key principles of equity and historical responsibility. So that also, since we know that there's a nexus between trade and environment and climate change, so the crisis out there, the crisis of multilateralism in the UNFCCC will also have a very detrimental effect on trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Perna, bringing the voice of LDCs into the debate. We often hear, a lot about the individual opinions about individual member states from the developed countries, and much less often from the key voices of the LDC trading partners. So we're very glad to have that here today. Without further ado, many of you may already know, but Richard Kozel-Wright, as the Director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies of UNCTAD, will share his views as, in my view, and the view of many people around the world, one of the persons who understands the role that trade has actually played in fomenting or constraining development around the world, and has the most latest research on what the actual implications have been. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm not sure about that. I mean, when I cross the Rue de Lausanne, I always get a little bit nervous because, unlike most of you and my fellow panelists, I'm not a trade expert, and we don't look at the development challenge purely through a trade lens. It's an old UNCTAD position that we live in an interdependent world, and it's the interdependence between trade, finance, technology, capital flows around which we need to position the development challenge, both in the past and currently. Let me give you my basic message. I don't have anything prepared. In a way, we find it's a bit odd that the crisis of multilateralism has come to be associated with trade, and people have suddenly started talking about the crisis of multilateralism out of recent events in terms of WTO and the trading system. And we find that odd because trade after the financial crisis actually helped to revive the global economy. And the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 was a profound shock, not only to lives and livelihoods, but to the predominant ideology and the predominant way in which the global economy had been structured over the course of the previous 30 years. And that was a previous 30 years that had significantly broken with the rules of the game broadly defined that had been created out of the chaos and destruction of the Second World War around the Bretton Woods institutions and related institutions. And so when people talk about a crisis in a 70-year international liberal economic order, which is how most of this narrative about the crisis of multilateralism seems to be framed, particularly in this institution, we simply don't see it in those terms. Because that order that was created after 1945 died in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when policymakers in the North rejected full employment as a principal goal of policymaking, when the deregulation of financial markets and the opening up of the capital account became a fixture of international policymaking, with an attendant increase in footloose capital, when the mixed economy became a dirty phrase for many policymakers. That's when the post-war international economic order died. So whatever we're talking about when we're looking at trade wars and Trump and Brexit and other features that seem to be part of this contemporary narrative, it's not about the end of the post-war international consensus and compromise. It's about a crisis of what in UNCTAD we've called hyperglobalization. And by hyperglobalization, we basically see three distinct features from the earlier period of globalization from the end of the Second World War. Clearly, there's an ideological component with the rise of neoliberalism as a dominant economic narrative. Neoliberalism, though, is not simply about more markets. That's a very basic kind of philosophical failure in a lot of the discussion of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is fundamentally about creating a set of rules that allow business to do what it wants, how it wants, where it wants, unencumbered by the actions of governments and other potentially distortionary elements, democracy, trade unions, other things that might get in the way of business doing what it wants, how it wants, where it wants. And for those that want to read that history, there's a superb book that's gone under the radar screen, unfortunately, by an American historian called Quinn Slobodian, called The Globalists, which is about the origins of neoliberalism, which are in this town. His history is about how essentially the Austrian economic tradition, in collaboration with the International Chamber of Commerce and the League of Nations, fashioned the early manifestations of neoliberalism in all the forms that we see it today, which is interesting because when a lot of people criticize what we in UNCTAD present as an alternative, which I will do very briefly at the end of my remarks, about, you can't go back to the old history of the post-war era. The irony of that is that most of the discussion that we hear in the shaping of the post-war, of the recent international economic discourse, goes back to that tradition of the 1920s and 1930s, which has resurfaced in the post-1979, 1980 period. So neoliberalism is one feature of hyperglobalization that needs to be stressed. The other feature is financialization. The dominant force in the contemporary global economy is not international trade, it's international finance. And it's not just simply the increased cross-border flows of capital, which is, of course, very, very significant. It's the financialization of economic life, the way in which financial criteria have not only shaped financial markets, but have shaped corporate governance, have shaped the way in which intellectual property is thought about and governed, and indeed the way in which economic policymaking is structured around a very specific set of policy goals and ideals. And the third element of hyperglobalization that we've identified in the work we've done, become more significant in the discussions recently, is the growing importance of rent-seeking behavior by the corporate sector as the way in which it increases both its economic and political influence in terms of business strategy. So these and it's just, I don't want to. We in last year's Trade and Development report we wrote extensively on this, but I want to say a little bit more about that in the context of international trade. So these are the three features of hyperglobalization which distinguish it from the immediate post-war type of globalization are neoliberalism, financialization, and rent-seeking strategies. And the consequences of that, as we've tried to set out extensively in the work that we've done in our Trade and Development report, are fourfold, I think. One is a growing dependence on indebtedness as a driving feature of the growth path of many countries. So hyperglobalization has become a highly indebted world, and not just indebted in terms of government debt, but in terms of household debt and in corporate debt. That's not an incidental feature of this world. This is how this world works. And this is a world that depends on very high levels of debt across all sectors. It's as you all know, it's a highly unequal world. Inequality is hardwired into the way in which a hyperglobalized world is structured, and that's again not just true of inequality across households. We've argued extensively in our work that it's actually probably more significant in terms of functional inequality. That is inequality between the capital and labor. This is a world that has been characterized by significant increases in the share of profits in national income and concomitantly a decline in the share of wages in national income. It's also a world that is highly unstable. Instability is a feature of the hyperglobalized world, and that was particularly true of developing countries in the 80s and 90s, but it's quite clearly become an endemic feature of advanced economies as the rose-tinted view of the great moderation has turned into a far more unstable a set of relationships in the advanced economies too. And finally, and perhaps most ironically, it's a world that has been characterized by insufficient investment. the big sell of hyperglobalization and a more predominant role for finance in the ordering of economic life was that it would lead to a more vibrant investment climate, greater capital formation, and rising productivity as a consequence of that greater capital formation. None of those features have characterized the vast bulk of economies, both developed and developing, in the course of the last 30 years, with one notable exception that Deborah mentioned in her remarks, namely China. And China has been able to do that in large part because it has not fallen for the rhetoric of financialization. It's been able to control capital flows and capital formation in its own economy. And that's an interesting question about why China was able to do that and whether and how we can how other countries can repeat that kind of successful model moving forward. Because, as Deborah said, it's one of the few success stories that we've seen in the era of hyper-globalization. So that's from our understanding, these are the features of a hyper-globalized world, which have extended, unfortunately, to not only beyond the workings of domestic economies, but into the workings of the multilateral system too. And that's not surprising, I mean, at least from our point of view, that features that are characteristic of the big players and the big economies in the global economy it's not surprising that those features would spill over into the workings of the international system. And I think it's good at this point because people particularly neoliberals who haven't read him, like to go back to Adam Smith at this point as a kind of father figure of the neoliberal tradition, which he wasn't, of course. And Smith had two very important insights about what we would call a rules-based system. Smith recognized, particularly in the theory of moral sentiments, that a rules-based system didn't just depend on the details of the rules themselves, but the trust that people had in those rules, and whether people trusted both the rules and the execution of those rules. That was a key feature of Smith's understanding of a healthy political economy. And one of the things that we've tracked, particularly since the financial crisis, although there were signs of it before, of course, was the removal of trust from political systems, both at the national level, but I think also at the international level too. At the national level, it's pretty obvious why this has happened. You know, the response to the financial crisis was essentially, how do we save the banks? And we saved the banks both by handing out very large amounts of taxpayers' money, which is how the banking system survived and recovered after the crisis, and then shifting the burden of the consequences of that action onto the vast majority of people through policies of economic austerity. And that combination of saving the institutions that caused the problems in the first instance and then shifting the burden onto your average citizen has clearly removed most people's sense of trust in the institutions, ultimately whose job is to provide for the welfare of its citizenry. And in many respects, obviously Trump and Brexit and other features, morbid features of the contemporary era are a product of that system. There's a wonderful line I use from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof by Tennessee Williams, where Big Daddy at one point says that the vacuum is sometimes a hell of a lot better than the things that nature fills it with. And I think that's probably true of our contemporary political environment as well. The other feature of the Smith story that I think speaks volumes to the current crisis of multilateralism is that Smith recognized that what he called the wretched spirit of monopoly was another powerful force that tends to undermine people's faith in a rules-based system, because the economic power that is associated with monopolies almost always translates into political power. That is, monopolies tend to reinforce their economic position by trying to capture the political forces that can reinforce that position. What the Chicago economist Luigi Zingales calls the Medici vicious circle, with a reference to 16th century Renaissance Florence, where the Medici family not only captured economic power, but used that to capture the political structures of Florence to reinforce that and to reinforce their economic position. And that's very much, I think, what we're seeing in the contemporary international system today. And again, with detrimental consequences, not only in terms of economic outcomes, but in terms of people's commitment to the system. Familiar to UNCTAD. Raoul Prebisch complained about these kinds of relationships back in the 1950s and 1960s, with a specific reference to the workings of commodity markets, which were back then a major source of income for most developing countries. But we see exactly the same in many global value chains in the current era, and this year's Trade and Development Report documents the way in which monopoly power has had highly unequalizing impacts in different parts of the chain, and particularly undermining those sections or weakening those sections of the chain engaged in production activities, and augmenting those sections of the chain engaged either in pre-production activities, whether that's financing or logistics, or post-production activities, whether that's marketing or branding, etc. And so the issues that Prebisch talked about back in the 1950s and 60s, we think have been intensified in the era of hyperglobalization, including through the way in which global value chains structure international trade and its opportunities and outcomes. Of course, in that context, and again, a part of the outcome of the shift in ideological thinking towards a more neoliberal mindset, free trade agreements are part of that, have been very much part of that story of rigging the rules of the game in favor of the already powerful economic actors in that game. And again, just to recall another Enlightenment mind other than Smith, Voltaire famously said that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, it was not Roman, and it certainly wasn't an empire. And I think we can say a similar thing about free trade agreements. They're not about freedom. They're about tying the hands of government. They're not about trade. They're about everything but trade. They're about state ownership and technology transfer and intellectual property and standards and regulations behind the border of one kind or another. And they're not about agreements. I think, as Vahini mentioned, Danny Roderick has written an excellent piece just tracing the way in which lobbying has influenced the outcomes of free trade agreements, and I think many people in this audience are familiar with that kind of process. So that in a sense, where this has left us and why we have a crisis of multilateralism, I think, is that we have a set of rigged rules of the game in which an increasing number of people are losing trust in. And unless we think about rigging those games to create more inclusive and sustainable outcomes and to rebuild trust in those rules, then the crisis of multilateralism will persist. And we in UNCTAD have offered a couple of historical analogies and my remarks here about where we think we might want to go. Last year we talked about the need for a global New Deal with an explicit reference to the political and economic initiatives that began in the United States in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression, but also had a profound influence on the shaping of the post-war rules of the game established in Bretton Woods and Havana in the late 1940s. Four elements essentially, and I won't go into them, make up a global New Deal. It has to be reflationary. Austerity is bad for trade. It's funny that everyone kind of jumps on Trump and his escalation of tariffs as a major threat to trade, whereas in fact in the last 10 years, the biggest hit that trade has taken is from austerity, macroeconomic policies adopted by just about all of the advanced economies. And no one talks about that as a threat to trade. Nobody. But it is the single biggest damaging impact on global trade that has happened over the last decade. And Trump's efforts actually pale into insignificance in comparison with the consequences of austerity economics. So you need a reflationary policy to have a healthy trading environment. You need effective regulation, particularly including regulation of corporate rent seeking, but also regulation of footloose finance. If you're going to have a healthy trading system, that was what John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White understood completely in the 1940s. You don't have a healthy trading and a free and open trading system if you have an unruly and unpredictable financial system. That was the origins of Bretton Woods. We got rid of that in the 1970s with detrimental consequences for trade. You need a third element of the global New Deal is redistribution. Inequality has to be tackled not only at the national and regional levels, we think, but with appropriate policies where applicable at the international level too. And finally, of course, it's a more complicated one, and in the end, even Roosevelt wasn't able to introduce it properly into his own New Deal. But economic rights was the last element of Roosevelt's global New Deal that never really took off. But introducing the question of rights, governance, representation needs to be, of course, part of any global New Deal. So we made that case in 2017 about why we need a global New Deal to rebalance the multilateral system. This year we've opted to recall the importance of the Havana Charter, which you all know, it's the 70th anniversary of the Havana Charter this year, and it was very sad. International bodies, the international community, the great and the good of the international community, like to celebrate things. 50th anniversary, 60th anniversary. We're always having no one talked about the 70th anniversary of the Havana Charter, even though it was, by some way, the most ambitious, and I would argue the best part of the documentation that came out of the Second World War, agreed to by 50-odd countries, most of them developing, but all developed countries involved signed up to it. Eventually, it died with the U.S. Congress essentially rejecting it, and the GATT, which was part of the Havana Charter, survived as the only part of the post-war international trading system. But the International Trading Organization that was identified as key to the establishing a post-war international trading order was a much more ambitious agenda than GATT. And it recognized many of the things that were part of the global New Deal. It wanted to tie the trading system to healthy labor markets. Full employment, rising wages were part of the agenda in Havana, and there was a strong recognition, again, that you don't have a healthy trading system in a world of unemployment where there is a race to the bottom with wages and labor standards. The two are incompatible. So that's an element that we think needs to become much more prominent in any discussion we have of rewriting multilateralism. Like the New Deal, the Havana Charter recognized a significant role for distribution policies. Controlling errant corporate behavior was a key feature of the Havana Charter. The rigging, particularly of commodity markets, but I think it was a more general concern about restrictive business practices was a feature of the Charter. Industrial policy, industrialization in the way Vahini talked about, was key to the to the Havana Charter. The signatories, North and South, wanted the South to industrialize rapidly. They wanted more Chinas back in 1945 to 50 than we eventually saw. That was part of the aim of the Havana Charter. There's an interesting comment, I think, by a senator from Kansas or one of the American states who was involved in the negotiations, who said and it's a bit ironic given what's happened subsequently, but he said we would like a city like Shanghai to look like St. Louis. That was the aim. That's what they wanted. Now, I guess a lot of people in St. Louis would probably want to look like Shanghai today, but back in 1945, that was the aim of the signatories of the Havana Charter. So those kinds of messages, and of course reworked to all the challenges in the 21st century, including those that Prerana talked about, need to be upfront, frankly discussed if we're going to get the kind of revival in multilateralism that does genuinely produce the kinds of inclusive and sustainable outcomes that Deborah talked about in her opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. That's amazing from 2 sticky notes that you were able to present all of that in such a logical fashion. Last but not least, we are very happy to have with us today Ravi Kant. You all may follow his writing in Mint, in the World Trade Online, and many other publications, including the South-North Development Monitor. He has been covering globalization trade in the WTO since before its existence. So we look forward to your remarks, Ravi.
Thank you, Deborah. I've started covering not for many decades, but into this city I came in 1998, and for the past 20 years I have been covering every development that has been happening in this organization on a daily basis for several publications. So I'm just going to reflect about the processes that take place here, which you don't hear in these public forum discussions. Some of my comments are going to be harsh, and I would, these comments definitely reflect my coverage. So I'll start off with a small statement, namely just to indicate what this organization is all about. Namely, just a fortnight before the Buenos Aires meeting, there was a little press conference at United Nations Press Center. It was organized by Journalists Association of United Nations. The chief guest, of course, was the Director General of this organization. And at that press conference, a journalist asked him, because by then things were very clear that at Buenos Aires meeting, there are not going to be any multilateral outcomes. And if anything, given the kind of preparations that the Director General's office was directly making in having these joint statements on issues that have no multilateral approval, but to be announced at Buenos Aires. This was reported by the journalist in several publications that the Director General's office in the month of September 2017 was sort of mobilizing the key players and preparing these joint statements. And here is the Director General who, when he came to power sometime in September 2013, from that period, September to December 2013, he worked tirelessly on an issue called Trade Facilitation Agreement. In fact, this hall used to be filled with the trade facilitation negotiators. Day in and day night, he worked so hard for the next 3 months that on an issue which was not a core issue of the Doha Work Program, this is one of the most controversial issues. In fact, before he became the Director General, he was the Brazil's trade ambassador to the WTO. In one of the Trade Negotiations Committee meeting, he had actually said that the Trade Facilitation Agreement is a market access agreement and that countries like Brazil are not getting any commensurate return for what they are going to agree in trade facilitation. That was the man who later became the Director General and who worked hard to get this trade facilitation agreement while completely ignoring the real issues of the Doha Development Agenda, whether it's agriculture or implementation issues or special and differential treatment improvements, or for that matter, the LDC package. I mean, ultimately, the face of this organization is sort of tested and measured on what it could do to the poorest of the poor countries. And the LDC package has been weighing heavy on this organization since 2005 Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration in Hong Kong. I mean, there are different stages, but suffice to conclude here, the Director General who worked on Trade Facilitation Agreement, because it was an agreement sought most by the United States and the European Union and several other countries, of what are called the Colorado Group. The Colorado Group was formed in 1996, and he was the man who has ignored the developmental issues which his own country had brought into full play starting from 2003. So why I'm saying all this is that this exposes, I mean, the kind of happenings here. This organization, I'm convinced from my writings, from my day-to-day report, it does not work for the developing countries. It does not work for the poorest countries. And if at all it works at the diktats of the big boys. There is sufficient evidence day in and day out about how the processes happen, how the processes result in results. So why I'm saying all this is Richard has raised a point about rules, execution of the rules, trust in rules. Now, I'm going to argue that the lawlessness in this organization, the lawlessness in the negotiations, the lawlessness in the functioning of the Secretariat, the lawlessness in the dispute settlement mechanism is so vividly reflected in the happenings here. Start with the negotiations, the lawlessness in negotiations. Lawlessness in negotiations starts when ministers adopt a certain negotiating mandate. And this negotiating mandate very clearly lays out what all have to be done, and following which a negotiating body is created. This was the case in 2002 when the Doha negotiating body was created, and it had a large agenda that encompasses issues like agriculture, industrial tariffs, rules. And in rules itself, there are several areas like improvements in anti-dumping, improvements in subsidies. There are regional trade agreements. There are fisheries subsidies. Then there were this so-called then services. Then also improvements in dispute settlement understanding and rules. More importantly, there were these controversial issues called 4 Singapore issues: trade and investment, trade and competition policy, trade and the government procurement, and trade facilitation. Now, what happened at the Cancun Ministerial, I'm sure most of you are aware that when the Cancun Ministerial took place in 2003, it had collapsed primarily because at one end of the table you had United States, which was refusing to do anything on agriculture, particularly reduction of the domestic subsidies. And then you had on the other end, the European Union, whose trade commissioner at that point of time was a man called Pascal Lamy, who later became the Director General of this organization, who was refusing to accept anything because none of the 4 issues which the European Union had pushed ruthlessly, namely trade and investment, government procurement, trade facilitation, and trade and competition policy, there was no explicit, the word explicit is most essential when this mandate was agreed, that when the Doha negotiations were agreed, that they agreed that at the 5th ministerial meeting, there has to be an explicit consensus among members so to proceed further on negotiating the 4 Singapore issues. So there was no explicit consensus at Cancun, and the negotiations collapsed. So they moved to 2004, and in 2004, in order to get the support of the developing countries, namely all the India and several other countries, the European Union and the United States, a man called Ambassador Zelek at that point of time, along with Pascal Lamy, they have sort of worked out on what is called the July 2004 Framework Agreement. And that Framework Agreement clearly set out that in order to negotiate trade facilitation, that the developed countries will sort of pay a payment in terms of less than full reciprocity, in terms of reducing the tariffs, a developmental agenda for agriculture, address the least developed country issues. This was the 2000 July framework. They're all there on the website. You can refer to them. And from 2004, you move to 2005. That was the Hong Kong ministerial meeting where they further clarified. For example, there was substantial clarification of what needs to be done on the LDC package, what needs to be done on agriculture, particularly on cotton. Cotton is such a vital issue for 4 West African countries, and they promised in the 2005 Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration that it would be addressed ambitiously, expeditiously, and without any delay. That the reduction in cotton subsidies plus the reductions in other agriculture domestic subsidies will be addressed on a war footing. Then comes 2006. From 2005, we move to 2006. And in 2006, by then you have a new Director General, a man called Pascal Lamy, who was earlier the European Union Trade Commissioner. Then he holds a meeting in this town. That meeting was the trade chiefs of 5 countries, US, EU, India, Brazil, and Australia. And that meeting again collapsed because the United States was unwilling to address the domestic subsidies issues, which was the central issue of that meeting. So in order to facilitate the United States, which was about to go for November elections in 2006, Pascal Lamy, the Director General, had suspended the negotiations. Now, suspending the negotiations was something unheard of in the negotiations. This is what one sort of chairman of the negotiations at that time, who is respected mostly by the developing countries, his name is Crawford Faulkner. He has coined a term called the Charles I movement of the negotiations. You remember Charles I? The Charles I of the 17th century, when he suspended the British Parliament and ended. So this was the 2006, and then negotiations were suspended all of a sudden by a Director General who wanted to enable the U.S. trade representative at that time called, I'll tell you the name in a minute, Susan Schwab, to face the elections. Of course, in those elections, the Republican Party got routed badly. And then we moved to 2007. Between 2006 and 2007, there was nothing. And in 2007, just to break some kind of ice on what was happening here, there was a meeting of 4 countries in a place called Potsdam in Germany. The Potsdam meeting was between the 4 trade chiefs, that is the US, EU, Brazil, and India. At that meeting, the US and EU suddenly turned the tables by saying that we will not address any of the issues in agriculture unless we get what we want in industrial tariff reduction commitments. Now, remember, industrial tariff reduction commitments were subject to the under the 2004 July framework. Developing countries will reduce tariffs in proportion to the developed countries, less than full reciprocity principles. So the whole negotiation was turned upside down in 2000. The 2007 meeting again collapsed at Potsdam. Then comes 2008. between 2007 and 2008, because of the efforts of this man called Crawford Faulkner in agriculture, there has been considerable sort of progress that many developing countries have welcomed it as having, when he came out with draft modalities, the first draft, the second draft, the third draft, and the fourth draft. The fourth draft came sometime in July 2008, and by then he had made substantial progress. There has been a certain welcome to his modalities, the draft modalities, and those modalities finally collapsed at the July 2008 meeting. There again, because one country was unwilling to discuss reduction commitments and domestic subsidies, it had to reduce its what is called the AMS from 22 billion to 15 billion. Initially, it had signaled that it will agree to that 15 billion. On the last day, it pulled the plug because there was massive opposition from its farm lobby back home in Washington. So you come to 2008, when when Crawford Faulkner had issued the revised draft modalities, which is the last major draft that had been there since then, and which developing countries always look up to as the one which has the landing zones. In fact, the Director General, when he was the Brazilian ambassador, he would always argue that the 2008 modalities is the final landing zones, and we, the developing countries, will not agree to anything. After the collapse of the 2008, we come to 2009, and at the 2009 meeting, the general mood was that how do you sort of resurrect this organization which is facing such systemic crisis in its face. So you have a meeting in 2009 basically discussing about, how to sort of improve the implementation issues within the organization. Then comes the 2011, the next meeting in Geneva. At that meeting, I think for the first time, there has been a very manufactured and an engineered change. Namely, that change was that in order to satisfy United States, what the members must do is that they should go by what is called paragraph 47 mechanism. The paragraph 47 says that issues which are ripe for sort of concluding can be concluded, provided they're all part of the final balance, because the Doha agenda has been working on the principle of single undertaking. From 2011 to 2013, which was the Bali ministerial meeting, the 9th ministerial meeting, the exclusive focus of this organization has been just on one issue, which is called the trade facilitation, nothing more. It initially started, the trade facilitation draft text started with some 800 brackets, and by the time Roberto Azevedo came to power in 2013 September, it has come down to some 400 brackets. So he took it as a warlike mission to conclude the trade facilitation agreement at the Bali meeting. Then after the Bali meeting, the big boys said goodbye to the Doha agenda, goodbye to addressing the agriculture issues. So effectively, they have brought an end to the Doha negotiations in 2015, and in 2015 you have what is called the Nairobi Ministerial Declaration, which had set the ground for the plurilateralization of this organization. So all this brings home the point about the lawlessness in the negotiations in terms of negotiating mandates being set aside just to sort of satisfy and achieve the goals of few countries at the expense of the majority of the countries. So we have a situation today that most of the issues of the Doha agenda are not addressed, and they are unlikely to be addressed. And while these people, the main proponents and protagonists for the so-called plurilateral issues proceed on a war footing to sort of make other members that they have no other alternative but to join these issues. Now, I come back to the other issue of lawlessness in the organization's functioning. This organization thrives on the principle of transparency and openness and notifications. For the past 1 month, there has been a lot of meetings on this budget committee. In that budget committee, one issue which is very important has been that on an issue called investment facilitation. Now, in May 2017, investment facilitation was blocked at this hall, the General Council, and following which there has been no mandate for it. But in the month of November, the Director General signs an agreement with one country to get $8 million to promote technical workshops on investment facilitation. After that, it became a controversial issue because he had no mandate, there was no formal approval. So when members started asking about sharing this document which he had signed, it has been refused. And until to date, over the last 2-3 months, this document, the Director General and his office have said that they cannot share. That speaks volumes about the transparency issues that are now being raised with a lot of importance. Now, dispute settlement, everybody knows that the fundamental existential issue right now staring in the face of this organization is the end of the appellate body. That appellate body on 1st of October has been reduced to 3 members. Come December 2019, it's virtually disappears. Not virtually, 2 members goes and then there'll be only 1 member. So effectively, it will be dysfunctional. It's already become dysfunctional. It's burdened with lots of disputes. Now, everybody in this town knows that this is an issue which needs to be addressed immediately. But now people are talking of 23, 30 issues, running away from the most important issue at this point of time to issues which are absolutely irrelevant. Because there are, if you actually want to argue, improve subsidies and other things, then you could have done it in the Doha agenda itself, which you have almost buried it. So here is, as Richard very rightly said, that if you erode the trust in the rules that you have created, if you erode the trust in the execution of the rules, there is a lawlessness which is all pervasive, which needs to be addressed regardless of any new issues, and any new issues which are only limited to a set of countries, not for the majority of countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. So we just have a few minutes, and I already see people coming in, I assume, for the next session. So we want to wrap up. I think in conclusion, we can say that given the incredible history sketched out to us by Richard, that the crisis in the multilateral system was actually born quite a few decades ago. And what we are seeing now is a predictable and actually predicted, I think UNCTAD predicted it many years ago, that there would be a backlash against this particular perverse, corporate-centered, financialized form of globalization in the rich countries, as well as the lack of progress and stability and development in the global south. And I think if we want to think about having a global trading system that actually functions, but more importantly, functions to be able for countries to use trade for their own development and prosperity, we're going to have to take a pretty hard look. It's not just a matter of getting another person on the appellate board. It's not just a matter of giving in to Trump in whatever he demands, which is some of the comments I heard in this room yesterday. it's really about a fundamental rethink. And we need to think about the devastation that the TRIPS agreement has done to countries of the North and South. You know, it costs people in the United States $380 billion a year. That's 2% of our GDP. That's what we pay more in medicines because of patents than other countries pay in the world for the same medicine. So we need to talk about getting rid of some of these terrible agreements. We need to talk about not having more liberalization in the GATS, and actually going back to what is supposed to be the functioning of a multilateral trading system in terms of pursuing policies that allow countries to pursue their industrial development, their digital industrial development, full employment, and the rest of the issues that were brought up. I hope that this session, even though I'm sorry that we didn't have time for questions and discussion, has provided some more serious thought and more serious reflection about the deeper issues that are underlying the current crisis in the multilateral trading system, so that we can actually talk about solutions that will work for people and the planet, and not just continue to entrench corporate interests in the WTO and other multilateral spaces. So I thank very much the panelists for their attention and their great wisdom, and thank you all for participating here with us today.